Hey everyone. So I'm gonna maybe mute so we don't have a thank you. A horrible echo of my voice. Who's that again? Forget her name. So there's one person here without their mic muted that's moving around. I think maybe she just stopped it. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a few people on the Hangout. Thank you for joining me. I was hoping everyone just watched the streaming. So thank you for being a part of the visual part of this call. We're just waiting for, or we're asking people, if you haven't already, to introduce yourself on the Etherpad. So starting, it looks like Susie's on line 63. And also take a moment to read through the names that you're seeing and any comments that they're making. Welcome, Paris from Kubernetes. It's awesome to have you here. Justin, it's so great to see you. And I think that you also had someone else in the room with you. I think you might have mentioned in an email.
Yes, I'm here with Brian. It's not in the Etherpad, but I'm here with Brian Exelbeard, the Fedora Community Action.
Awesome. Welcome, Brian. Carol Nichols from the Rust core team. Welcome, Carol. It's always nice to see you around. Larissa, the head of diversity at Mozilla. It's so great to have you, of course, on this call. Matt from Chaos Project. Maybe even, Matt, you might want to put a link to the Chaos Project for those that might not know about that. Awesome project already. Welcome, Celine. Catherine. So nice to see your name there. Jan Christoph from Nextcloud. Michael, and a bunch of other names. This is great. So yeah, definitely take a moment to go through all these lists, as I will. Add comments and questions if you see people that you don't know, or if there's areas that you're already thinking about working together. So some kind of just not ground rules, but some background on this call. This is our first diversity inclusion open source community call. It's about a year in the making for Mozilla. A lot of the research that we have worked on, a lot of the recommendations coming out of that research really spoke of how important it was to reach across open projects, that a lot of us are working on similar things, you know, and kind of reaching the same levels of success, but maybe together we can really accelerate that success. And so this call is to begin to explore that through first looking through the lens of a survey that we just did on diversity and inclusion. And then next on the agenda is going through into like, what is this call? What could it be for you? What does really help look like to you? And what is it that you'd love to accomplish? You know, what brings you here? We're trying to be accessible through this call itself. You'll notice on line 24 that we do have live captioning. I'm just going to make sure. Yep, it seems to be working. So hopefully this helps people in a number of ways, including perhaps later on localization. You can join the Hangout link on line 13. If we're not already full, I forget that. I'm guessing the maximum was 12, or you can just watch along on YouTube. The Etherpad that you're writing on is a great way to collaborate asynchronously. So throughout this call, please do jot down questions, comments, and we'll try and work on doing asynchronous conversation through that as well. Deb, I see that you're asking about a phone number. Right, you can watch on YouTube. There is no phone number for this call, but one of the things we're going to do is evaluate how this went for the next one. Awesome. So I'm going to get right into the first part of this call, which is to review the findings from a diversity and inclusion survey that we recently ran. And I'll give you the background and share my screen. So in case you're not familiar with this survey, it actually comes on the heels of some research that we did last year. We've done a lot of research within Mozilla's communities and some external and other projects, but we really wanted to ask some of the same questions we're asking within our communities more broadly. So this agenda goes through the background and goals of that survey, who participated, some of the insights, what we learned about data and metrics for diversity and inclusion, some standards and best practices that have come out of that, and then maybe we'll get to we will get to some questions. So first, a little bit of background. Last year, we spent 3 months researching what does it mean when we say diversity and inclusion, and what does that mean for a global community? What does that mean with various languages, geographic disbursement, gender identities, access to technology? I mean, it's a massive, massive thing to even understand. And so we spent 3 months going through all the data that we had, which was, many different types of data in different forms. It was like quite a big job. There's no uniform ways that we were collecting information or measuring or asking questions. So the quantitative piece was quite difficult. We also interviewed over 90 people in focus groups and one-on-one interviews, including interviewing people in their own language, in text-based, and other ways. We really tried to be diverse in how we reached people. And coming out of that, we had 12, about a set of 12 different recommendations, and one that really is where the survey comes in. And so one of the recommendations that we really need to develop standards and best practices for metrics that matter in diversity and inclusion, right? So going through surveys and various databases where we're asking questions in different ways, and it's really hard to tell if any of the interventions that we make in our communities are actually having the impact that we want, right? So like having these standards is really critical moving forward. And so this survey was really an attempt at a first go at, how do we do that? Like, what do standards look like for asking questions and understanding the experiences of diverse people and in open source? And so around goal setting, we used a project you may or may not have heard of called Open Demographics. It's by Nikki Stevens at Dr. Nikki on Drupal. She's been documenting some of the ways that we might ask these questions. So we set goals to build on her work, and also to really begin to answer questions about leadership. Who feels included in the opportunity to be a leader in open source communities? What are the blockers and the motivations of different people? And finally, some research into how a code of conduct or Mozilla's community participation guidelines for our communities actually influences like safe spaces and empowerment of people. So that's around the goal setting, was around data and metrics, understanding like leadership, motivations, and our code of conduct. And then finally, our outreach was and we did some broad outreach, but we really tried to reach out to those areas in different communities where we knew diverse people participated. We did some shoulder taps, right? One of the things that we've learned through our research is that you need to say, hey, you, right? This means you, this means your group. We want to learn from you. So who participated? We saw, it was actually interesting. We thought that we would target some communities. So we thought we'd really, Nikki's from the Drupal community, the Mozilla community. We'd love to learn from Kubernetes and Linux and a few others. And so that was part of our targeting. We actually ended up with over 202 different projects represented, which I thought was great because it provided that kind of cross-project anonymity as well. We had 489 people take this survey, and you'll see as we move on that a lot of those people selected into this survey, I believe, because they wanted to share their experiences. There was definitely rich diversity in that number. And starting with gender identity, so I was happy to see, well over 30% of the responses from women and non-male genders. So just knowing that we had that perspective in there, and quite a number of people identified as being transgender, which again, understanding those experiences was really important to us. From a diversity of geographic perspective, we had some and we didn't. And this is probably some limitation of language. So we actually had a question, and I'll get into some of the things we learned about your proficiency in English. Of course, the question was asked in English. So, I think the people that were comfortable speaking English were represented best. So North America, Europe, South America, you can see the numbers there. This is the breakup of age. So it was really interesting, I thought, to see so many people over 30 responding here. And I think, there's some breakdown later about how that applies to project, but it wasn't as obvious as you might think. For example, you might assume that people who were over 30 were contributing to open source on behalf of their project, on behalf of their employer, but that wasn't always the case. I'll get into that in a bit. We also asked about disability, so open demographics. This is the current set of questions that are listed for disability. Some people did a self-identifying here as well. We also tried to categorize by technical competence. That's a word that we've been using to talk about how people feel about their ability within technical context. It's not necessarily competence, so you'll see me use that word. We learned that in our research last year that women were less likely to rate their technical competence as being as high as men did. So this is something we've tried to dig on a little more. Access to technology, that includes bandwidth, access to technology, and also like their experiences growing up if they had access to technology, and just their regional location. So that was us also trying to get around socioeconomic questions of finances and education. We're trying to think about other ways that people are limited. We also asked people to identify their role in the community. So we had quite a few people who identified as core contributors, which was awesome, especially because we were focused on community leadership. So those are some of the people that in identity, the way that identities broke out. And so here's some of our insights. Mentorship matters, and this is almost like, yes, we hear this a lot, but it really, seems to be the case for people who were 10% of contributors listed access to leaders and other contributors as being like a major obstacle for them if they did not have that access, and 45% of people listed mentorship or inclusion of others as critical in whether they believe that their roles were achievable or not. So people were 20% more likely to believe leadership roles were achievable, and 11% more for non-male identities where they had been included by others in the past. These are just some quotes. I'm trying to pull out some quotes because as much as we were qualitative in our questions, as expected, the comments really informed us even more. Some specific insights are to formalize informal roles. And I'm just sorry to bring up my notes here. So one of the things we found in this survey was that people, their ability to visualize their success as a leader in the future was largely dependent on how they described their role now. And it was just a trend in comments around informal roles, where people felt their role was informal and not established. They felt less likely, less optimistic about their opportunities for success in the future. This came from the second recommendation or insight is to ensure cycles of renewability, including succession planning. So we have seen gatekeeping in some communities, and gatekeeping is really described as, the opportunities are limited to a select few for a number of reasons. So cycles of renewability are just about deliberate design by the project, but also succession planning being something that leaders are assigned to do, which is to think about how to bring others in. 28% of people listed toxic behavior as an issue in projects, which is quite a lot, with 11% saying it's something that they experience on a regular basis. And I haven't broken this out by any specific project, just in case anyone's wondering if they're going to see project names. It was a variable across all. So addressing toxic behavior, especially star contributors. There is a white paper in the industry that says, in HR at least, that toxic people do tend to be very productive. And I think in some of the comments I saw, the type of person that was being described as most toxic had those same kind of rock star attributes, and that people were afraid to remove those people. And getting into code of conduct resolutions, that was actually quite obvious that was a blocker for proper enforcement, was the inability to move people we felt were important to the project, even if they were toxic. 45.5% of non-male participants say they've experienced sexism, sometimes, with 17% saying regularly. Then that's quite a bit. So thinking again about shutting down behaviors that isolate and exclude, like sexism, racism, ageism, socioeconomic status. 9.6 of people face racism regularly was another finding, with 6.1 facing that regularly. Another insight was that not everyone wants to lead. So we're trying to measure people's understanding of whether or not they could lead, their ability and willingness to. And some people are just like, I just rather work on a bunch of projects rather than lead one, which is great. I mean, trying to push people into leadership roles because they're highly productive or really good at something is obviously something that an important insight. And also from some of our older contributors, there's very, very low level of interest in leading things. And I like this last quote that he would offer, probably unwanted advice, but let others lead. So I tried to pull out interesting quotes on the right side, so I hope that you'll be able to take time to read those. So some of the other insights were to watch technical jargon. This turns up almost all the time in research that we've done. So, people rated their technical confidence as being low very often. So the technical jargon is like exclusive, speaking more technically than necessary. It's about documentation that unnecessarily throws a bunch of difficult examples in. There's a lot of ways that technical jargon excludes people, but just to watch that. And this, again, is not about ability. It's about confidence. Make space and give air to less dominant personalities. 23.3% of people said that 39.7 say being an introvert or less confident interferes with their ability sometimes, with 15% saying their introversion or lack of confidence regularly interferes with their ability to step up. And something that we do in a lot of Mozilla events is to say, if you're somebody that talks a lot, then maybe think about stepping back and trying to listen a bit more. And if you're someone that doesn't speak a lot, then maybe try and step up. Giving people those challenges has been one way that we've tried to do that, at least in events. Captioning, transcript, and other text-based ways for people to interact. So in calls like this, or even just things that you're sharing at events, people really feel included when we're considering how they experience the world. So another great quote, actually this is from our other research, was that neurodiverse people are overrepresented in tech, yet technical events are skewed towards neurotypical attendees. Maybe this is less the case in recent months, but I think that was a pretty interesting insight. Accommodate low or limited bandwidth in comms and opportunities. And this is, with this call, we found that people with low bandwidth have a hard time connecting to, especially in parts of the world where this survey isn't represented. As far as documentation, 57% said often, and 22% said regularly they cannot figure out where to start. So make how to start documentation a priority. And maybe that's per initiative, maybe that's per project. That maybe is up to you to think about, but that just came up as one of the highest drop-off points for people. Okay, so say thank you was the number one thing that people appreciated from their contributions, just in any form, GitHub, blog posts. So definitely say thank you. I also mentioned happiness packets. I think, Justin, that might be from you over at Red Hat. There's lots of ways to say thank you. People appreciated it. It seems so simple, so maybe we overlook it. First bugs for learning are nice, but seeing contribution as part of a project or initiative matters most. And so that's related to 60.2% of people say seeing their work as something bigger is most valuable to them. And 74% of people say having impact on the world matters. So combining the opportunity to see your code do something, or your editing and your translation do something to make the project or product better, but also having impact on the world. So that was a huge motivation for people. 67% of people are motivated by belonging to a community. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold. I'm trying super hard not to cough. I'm just going to drink for a second. %35% of people contribute as part of their job. And I did actually do some research here to see if it was more likely to be a project like Drupal or WordPress containers where it was part of people's work, and I didn't see any trends there. This survey might not be big enough to properly say, but I think that was interesting to think about. So these are some of the blockers in order. So the number one reason people leave, not surprising, thanks Emma, I get too busy. But there's strategies there for how we can help people create bridges to come back. Confusing documentation, I think this also came out of the GitHub diversity survey recently, and I think aligns with the people don't know where to start. Technical confidence just keeps coming up. That was a number 3. Toxic people. I don't agree with how things were run was surprisingly high, maybe not surprising, but also, how high up that was is interesting. So maybe there's opportunity to bring diversity into our governance groups more. I'm sure there is. And childcare and elder care, especially for women, was marked as a top reason people do not participate. So, code of conduct. This is some of the most interesting, maybe I think it's most interesting because I've been working a lot on this recently. The question we asked was, does your code of conduct hold on, I might have skipped one. No. Does your code of conduct make you feel safer and more empowered? And there's not really a huge difference between the whole group and the non-male group. But I think there's like this huge chunk of no, like these are quite big numbers really that people are just saying no is really interesting. And I don't have any answers or recommendations around this now. I think this is something that we could maybe as a group or as a cross project dig into a little bit more. And also I don't know, which I could suspect, maybe you have suspicions as well, that's about, they don't know if they haven't seen, sorry, my survey is right. And there's another slide here that actually seems to be missing. I thought that was maybe too easy. That was around whether or not the code of conduct was enforced. So while I think it was something like 71% of people know that their project has a code of conduct or CPG, there was about 41% of people believe it was enforced. So there's really a lot of work to do around code of conducts. And I'd love to dig into that with all of you at some point. So some of the findings around, there's a lot of comments in the code of conduct, like free fill box, including some not very nice comments. So as a contributor, it's really hard to tell if the CPG is enforced. Oops. And so I just have a footnote here that, what is the way that we could, across communities, rate the code of conduct or signal to people who are joining our projects that that code of conduct is enforced. Even if it is enforced, it's hard to tell to what extent to trust that. So there's different, I think this first quote up here, that they created a code of conduct, but it was heavily lobbied against, watered down, and rarely enforced, signals that we have a lot of code of conducts that aren't actually enforced, or maybe for show is maybe not quite the right word. But so I think that to that extent, there's a trust issue. Enforcement is sometimes perceived to be in the hands of the wrong people. In some cases, people believe that the project owner is not the right person to be enforcing code of conducts, but there wasn't always like strong sentiment about who that should be. A vocal minority are sometimes against code of conduct. So again, there was some unfriendly messages. They were limited, but unfriendly enough to take a whole diversity survey just to provide that feedback. Few of any projects have visibility for the processes. I'd happy to be wrong, but people didn't seem to be able to point to where their code of conduct processes lived, other than a form or a link. They didn't understand the whole workflow. Many projects have yet to tackle NDA and their approaches to resolving community health issues. This was actually more of a qualitative interviewing that I did around the code of conducts, which indicated that we sometimes have volunteers in communities handling really personal information without like the legal boundaries that protect people's privacy. And we need better strategies for anonymous reporting. So this kind of relates into trust. I think a lot of people prefer to report anonymously because that trust is not there, or they're worried about their personal safety, and so strategizing for better ways people can report anonymously. Excuse me. Please do add questions in the Etherpad as well. I'll get to those right after this. And so what did we learn building this survey, which was the whole exercise, right? Was just to understand like how we can ask really good questions. Sorry again. Ask really good questions that don't violate people's privacy and get to the root of how we can be more inclusive. What did we learn? So we failed at ethnicity. I just want to call this one out. One of the reasons we didn't have a question on ethnicity in our survey was because we didn't know how to do that on a global, as it relates to global ethnicity. So, so we left out the question altogether, which was a mistake. We should have, we realized that it made people feel excluded by default, and I think maybe just a free-form box would have been the right choice at this point. Not trying to think about all the possible answers, but just allowing people to identify their ethnicity if they wanted to. So that was really good learning. We need regional strategies for diversity and inclusion, including data and metrics. So this relates a little bit to ethnicity, but understanding, if we're going to have a list of gender spectrum, what makes sense in North America might not make sense in India. And again, with ethnicity, the list for North America might not make sense in South America. So having regional strategies is important in making people feel like you're hearing them. As much as our goals were around qualitative data structures, standardization of how we ask questions, I really realized how important qualitative is here in diversity. There's just no way around it. It's my favorite type of research, but there's no really, sorry, 2 seconds. It's really important. I would have included more qualitative questions in here. The project list was inadequate, so then part of that's because we didn't think we'd get so many projects responding, and so we had like Mozilla and Drupal and Kubernetes and Rust, and then our other our other box was like huge. So it was really hard to splice the data properly because of that. We kept our geography as continents to protect people's privacy and safety around gender. And we left out Oceania, and we found out that this is something that people who are in the little islands in the in the ocean would like us to include, so we did. And that was really great learning. People want multiple checkboxes for gender. This was another good learning. Questions were sometimes leading. So, for example, having a list of blockers or list of motivations is almost like a way of co-creating answers. And I'm not 100% sure that listing those motivations is a good technique. I'm still figuring that out. I would force top choices. So when I select, one of the questions was around motivations. Like people would select all of them because they're all awesome. So I would definitely limit choices to really get at what most matters to people. I would consider hostile responses and filtering. So I had to read some things that I didn't want to read. And I'm not sure how to filter those in future. Set of rules for when to ask questions. So definitely we knew why we were asking the questions that we did around gender and whether people were transgender, and just being really deliberate about why we're asking questions, if we should be asking those questions in future. And that cross-project query is important to helping us understand where we can work together most effectively. So this is our repo, and I have some data and best practices in there. I also, at the top of the Etherpad, there's a link to our wiki with more of this. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing now. Awesome. So questions. Now you can either verbalize these. I'm currently looking in the Etherpad, but if they're like, or any I missed, please let me know. How do folks think we should move forward together on ways to know code of conducts are enforced is a very complex issue? Does somebody have any thoughts on that one?
I asked the question, and I'm really asking because I'm wondering if people are thinking. Full disclosure, with considerable support from Emma and other people, I rewrote our CPG last year, and one of the biggest goals was to make it enforceable. And I think it's worked, and Emma and I have both done a lot of work in that space, but it's really a big learning process, and I'm really interested in other people's processes there. And I was really interested in the idea that we could come up with some sort of standard or something whereby people looking at open source projects would be able to see that that organization definitely is taking behavior seriously and taking action, right? And I'm not sure what that is, but to me, it's one of the most pressing issues. So I was just interested in other people's thoughts.
So I'm muted, sorry. So thank you for answering on line 95 around the code of conduct.
Testing, can anyone hear?
Yes.
I think folks are muted right now.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can now, yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay. Did you want to speak, Tony, or were you just doing some audio help for us? I'll assume audio help. So regarding the question around NDA, was the concern disclosure or that volunteers were handling sensitive information or both? And how does that sync with who should be enforcing? So at Mozilla, for our core contributors, we have a process for NDA, which includes people who work on governance and community health issues, especially the Reps Council. You might not be familiar with the Mozilla Reps program. It's definitely about handling sensitive information, including legal consequences, perhaps. And how does that sync on who should be enforcing? The way that we've been enforcing has been on a RACI scale. So if you're not familiar with that term, that's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. We work on as a group, so that changes with every report, or there's some things that stay the same, but some that expand and contract. So I guess my answer is it depends on what you're working on and if their NDA seems important, but it felt like in some of the interviews that people hadn't considered the implications of sensitive information and volunteers.
So just a quick thing building on the question that was just discussed. Disclosure. I'd be very interested in people's thoughts around disclosure, especially when reports are made. What kind of responsibility do we have, to the community to inform them that things have happened? Things get way more complicated, especially when leadership or management is involved in these things. So one of the conversations we're having in the Node project right now is, what does responsible disclosure look like? And we're erring on the side of just we don't disclose anything. But at one point we were thinking, like, in the case of leadership being called out, that perhaps there should be some sort of disclosure. But again, I'm leaning right now towards just no public disclosure. But I'm really not sure what the right thing to do there is.
I'm interested in Emma's take too. That's been our pattern as well, but I think there's a challenge, especially for, and I realize that we're a large project and I'm saying this, but compared to big companies that disclose behavioral things publicly, think James Damore, et cetera, we can't do that because it would tank us. And for a smaller open source project, no doubt it would tank us, right? If someone were to do a major lawsuit. So I think not disclosing is very prudent in that vein. On the other hand, we've often heard feedback from our community, both volunteers and staff, that there's no way for them to know that we take things seriously if they don't hear about the results of them, right? Which is a very complicated thing because sometimes that's literally illegal to do. It's really a tough issue. So we've erred on saying nothing for privacy and risk aversion reasons. But it's complicated because we really do want folks to see that your policies have teeth, right? And at the same time, it's very difficult to share these things, even with people under NDA or who are employees of your organization, right? Even in that context, it's not always possible to share them.
Yeah, so like I've participated and helped organize meetups where when there were code of conduct violations or reports, that we made like a public announcement to the group that, hey, like there was a report, we dealt with it, and maybe like an extremely anonymized, minimized version of what it is. I think something like that, especially when we're talking about a physical space, is really important. But yeah, when we're dealing with the project, and especially de-escalation, which you mentioned, it's like there is a danger of talking about this stuff that either the person who was moderated or the person who brought it up is becoming a target of harassment for us even discussing it, especially if it takes an extended period of time to come to a conclusion. Like, why would we want to like bring this all back up again? And so, yeah, we're going to put together some disclosure policy around the Node project and likely open a pull request around that. And I'll tweet about it when we do. And if anyone has thoughts, we'd really love, for you to chime in.
What I hope is over time, maybe we can start to, there'll be enough. I mean, I don't want there to be a lot of reports. Like, hopefully we're starting to trend towards community health, so we never have a bulk of information that we can anonymize like that. But I hope we can eventually say, this year we managed this many incident reports, and I don't know, like have some positive statistics around that. I don't know what those are just yet. I'm also exploring the idea of being more visible with the workflow. So this is where it starts, because a lot of time people report and they don't know what happens yet, but letting them know the stages, like, so there's reporting and there's investigation and there's communication and here's where you're here, and then and then there's a follow-up, and just letting people know that there's a whole like pipeline to this, so at least they can visualize it. I think visualization is really important, even if they don't know exactly how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, one thing that was just dawning on me that I thought could be really useful is we have like the Code of Covenant as a shared document that a lot of projects rely on. In my personal opinion, a code of conduct without like clear moderation policies is really problematic. And perhaps like-minded people from various projects could work together on creating a similar document around some of these processes and acting on the code of conduct. If anyone has an interest in that, I'd love to collaborate.
Miles, do you mind adding that as on the Etherpad there, because it sounds like something that people would be interested in. I, for one, would, but I just don't want to lose it. It's just like a call out at the bottom there to work on something specific. So lots of people are starting to write. I can't follow all this right now, but please do engage and continue to have those conversations. I'll check back later. I'm conscious we only have 15 minutes left. In the future, this is not just an Emma talking call. If you know Emma, you know that she's actually not that big into being the primary talker. But the idea would be that in the future we would have other topic presenters bringing ideas, bringing topics. Maybe there's a working group, like Miles was just saying, working on something and present their findings. I don't know. Let's explore what this call could bring to all of us. So if you'll look at line 123, I wrote a blog post. I'm more of a writer than a speaker, and outlining this call, but also 125 through 140 are some questions that I have that I'd really like to make this call awesome for all of us working on diversity and inclusion. So if you're able to take a moment to answer some of these questions, how can bringing us together help you, your project, and the open source ecosystem? So I have some very dreamy visions of how we can really start to move the needle in diversity and inclusion through this sort of collaboration. I think that I'm interested in your similar dream sequences for the ecosystem, but also for you. What is the value to you? Is it actually working on things together? Or is it, I want to be able to come to this call to ask people questions, which I think is also a valid way to participate, because I want to make room for all those different perspectives. So that question is on line 127 of the Etherpad. 132 are topics. So and 134, I'm thinking of paying a speaker and publishing that list in advance. So there's specific topics or speakers that you'd like to see on this call. Please add that as well. I'd love to hear from you and who you'd like to hear from and who can help us as a cross-project work more efficiently together. If you'd be interested in leading topics, please leave your name below. I might ping you for the next one. Another question is, if you think we should consider, how else do you think we should design these calls? And finally, should this call be streamed in future? I'm thinking of privacy, for example. And you can also verbalize. So go ahead.
Sometimes it's helpful to have both public and private sessions in case there are things that need to be discussed that are a little bit more sensitive. So perhaps saving 10 or 15 minutes for people to have a private conversation may be helpful.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. So again, on line 128, 129, 130, how can this call benefit you, your project, or the ecosystem? This will help me make the call better use of your time. Do we have a schedule for these calls? I'm sorry, I'm looking in the chat on Hangouts. So at the very top of the Etherpad, I have a link to a wiki page. I haven't picked a date for the next call because one of my questions to this group was going to be how often feels useful and not like another meeting. Is that once a month? Is it every 3 weeks? But I will, if you check back on that wiki link, then the next sort of I'm going to read some of the other comments at the top. Would it make sense to develop shared code of conducts that are used across multiple open source projects? What would be the drawbacks? Somebody linked the covenant, the contributor covenant there. That might be more of a Larissa question. I know that one of the issues we've heard is people don't understand how, if they're at an event, if that's the code of conduct at the event, how that interacts with the code of conduct of their project, who to report to. There's concerns around overlapping sometimes.
You didn't mean I should answer that now, did you?
No, well, if you have thoughts on it, I mean, the thing is that, like, is it possible?
I think it's really hard. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are sometimes literally overlapping things, right? Like, as a community of Mozillians or Mozilla-related projects, we like to say that the community participation guidelines are always in effect for us, right? But first of all, sometimes people don't know that, even though we try really hard to say so. And sometimes people still don't know how to make a report. And sometimes that means they're under more than one code and they're different, right? So if you're representing Mozilla someplace and that place also has its own code of conduct and it's different, then how do you choose? I don't think we've worked that out yet. I'd be super interested in other people's thoughts. But what we're trying to say here is that the simplified version of that is, if you're representing Mozilla, you're under our CPG, wherever you are, right? Because otherwise it's too nuanced. And then sometimes folks have additional stuff for their event, which makes sense because for example, the escalation path might be different for an in-person event.
So did anyone want to verbalize their comments here about the call in future? There's a lot of different things. Anyone want to just speak to what they've written here? If you're on the actual audio part of the call. There's a lot of plus ones around a mailing list, so we could get a mailing list together. Maybe discourse. I'm mindful of privacy and some of the topics that we speak about, and the more projects that might be collaborating here, my default is to think about the safety of the conversations first. But I'm happy to be challenged on that. Great, so if people are interested in leading topics on ageism, that would be great. Talks about diversity and women's participation. So I'll be reaching out to you, like definitely put your name. I can probably line you up, but do put your name if you're interested in talking. D&I challenges, recruiting for diversity. These are awesome, you guys. Thank you so much this is all great stuff. Now, I've also, like, one other question is about Hangouts. So I tried to optimize for people that might not, we use video or Vidyo, but you have to install software sometimes, and I'm realizing that Hangouts limits the number of people. Does anyone have better solutions than the one I just used today? I can also just put this question in
I think
Etherpad.
it came up in the Etherpad, but we've been
Okay.
using Jitsi in Fedora. It's a completely open source video client or video WebRTC based audio
Okay.
video form, and it works pretty well too. I don't know how that would work with the streaming part of the equation, but
It'll stream to YouTube.
oh, so it'll stream to YouTube too.
Okay, cool. And how many people can it take?
I don't know that I haven't heard the limit.
Yeah, I don't know if that's something we've hit before.
Okay.
And will it work, like, since it's WebRTC based, does that mean that people on other operating systems can just use another WebRTC based viewer? Is that how that would work?
I think so. Yeah.
It runs in a web browser, so I think I don't think there are any dependencies.
Yeah.
I haven't used it. Yeah, that it should be fine.
Okay. All right, D&I challenges, recruiting for diversity, dealing with problem players in person, online, and anonymous. So there's a lot of interest in working on code of conduct type of activities. Maybe we can break those out a little bit, and maybe I'll work to do that and share it with you. Protecting reporters, really important. And I think that also ties in with why people report anonymously. Should you optimize for specific interaction? What do you do if those things come to conflict? People have a fist fight at an event. I'm sure there's at least one person who deals with events on this call. That might be another way to break this out. I've heard Sage Sharp mentioned a couple times. I've reached out to them already. So that would be great. Hopefully they're interested in presenting something like that. The limits of enforcement, and maybe that's a whole discussion topic we could have in one call. And curious how to host diversity events and how people feel when replace women events and how to handle that. Oh, okay. That's so we have 6 minutes left. As far as diversity events versus women's events, my only insights on that are that when we specifically use women to mean all non-male or non-binary people, then that can feel people feel excluded. So to just specifically say who you mean to invite. So I'm not sure if diversity is the right word either. So we could explore that, but just the one thing that we did learn is that people like to be invited specifically. So if you mean non-binary people, invite them by name.
That's such a long topic, but
yeah, it's a long topic. I
find it sometimes is also the case that we say we want a women in tech event when we really mean we want a meeting of people who are in underrepresented communities in tech. On the other hand, sometimes we actually mean we want a specific demographic for a safe space. So yeah, say exactly what you mean, I think is the most important thing.
I mean, discussing beyond gender. Totally. I got that. That's a great point. Yeah. And something in our other research, which maybe is all linked on our wiki that I posted at the top, included identity groups, like how in open source, some projects are really good at making space for people to form around an identity. Like there's so many, and how can we be more supportive of those types of groups? Great. So I'm going to turn off this streaming video right now. I'm going to keep typing on the Etherpad, as I hope you will. I will be in touch about a next meeting based on your feedback. I will be in touch regarding a speaker and topics based on your feedback. And for those that have suggested ways we can work together, thank you very, very much. And I will try and facilitate those coming. This is far more information than I was expecting, so I'm quite overwhelmed and grateful for your time and for your energy and questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Emma.
Thanks. Bye. Oh, yeah.